We are back speaking with former Connecticut Governor John Rowland about the state's response and reaction to the attacks of 9/11. You mentioned that you had been calling down to the mayor and the governor of New York, and I'm wondering how much did they know what they needed?
Well, that's a great question, because at that point, you're so numb from the implosion and not knowing whether there's 3,000 or 30,000 that have lost their lives. And the first initial response is, are there any other points where there could be attacks? And you start to think about, Fairfield County, you think about the state. So in my case, there were really three different things going on. One was, how do I help Mayor Giuliani in New York City? How do I help the 40,000, perhaps a lot less, Connecticut residents coming back to New York? And then how do I help heal and reach out to the rest of the state as we go through this grieving process, this unimaginable event that's taken place. First time, obviously, for most of our generations, most of us not having been through, World War II and, attacks in Pearl Harbor. This was really the first time anything of this magnitude has ever happened. So the first thing we did was we sent our troopers down. We had the National Guard called up. We had our helicopters down there helping out. But I hate to say it, the K-9 unit was really the most significant support that we had in those early days and hours. And I went down there, spent some time with them. And I'll tell you one of the high points, if there could be one, when we left the site, both the day after 9/11 and the day I was down there with the president, as you left the site, there were just thousands and thousands of volunteers lined up on the roads that exited the 9/11 site, which was, I can't even describe it to you, just smoke-filled and twisted, trucks and cars and just papers flying all over the place. It was like a Hollywood scene. You can't imagine it was the city of New York. But as you're leaving 9/11, the site, thousands of volunteers just lined up, sitting there applauding. And don't forget, this was disorganized chaos, because you had volunteers, you had Red Cross, you had construction companies just driving down with these big pieces of machinery to move things along. And so there was no real way to organize all of this, and just thousands of people running around. But just seeing the spontaneity of the people, applauding the volunteers and the firemen and the policemen was incredible.
I bet. Did our K-9 units recover?
They did. Oh. They did. And they were very involved, with a few other groups. And they did. They were recovering bodies. And I'm not sure if they found anybody alive. And there were always stories of people that survived and how they survived. But that was unfortunately kind of a necessary process. And it went on for days and weeks afterwards.
You also went with the president a few days later when he first visited. Tell us about that.
Well, again, going back down to the site, you would think, days later that it wouldn't smell the same and be the same, but it really was. And when we were there, of course, we were with the governor and the mayor and the president, and I watched him last week talking about that day and, kind of experienced in parallel what he was thinking throughout those moments, although he had a much bigger job. But what's interesting, unscripted moments are sometimes the best, and just watching him coordinate and just thank the volunteers and the firemen. The thing was, everybody was exhausted. Yeah. Because you don't go down there for 2 hours and volunteer to look through rubble for people. You're there for 20 hours, 30 hours, 40 hours. So everybody was exhausted by that point, and you're just dirty and covered and just, you're kind of losing hope. And so when the president arrives, you can just see the kind of the confidence coming back and the hope coming back. So it was a real cool moment to just see people kind of stepping up and saying, wow, we're going to do something about this. And I thought he gave the best words I've ever seen him give in any environment. And when he talked about, hey, yes, we're going to get these guys back, but, we're America, we can get through this. So it was words of hope. It was words of, we're strong. It wasn't a lot of vengeful discussion, which I think was very important. You don't want to incite people's anger.
Right.
And so I thought it was very comforting, and he really showed true leadership, as most of the officials did in these moments.
So how much did you use that? Because you had to go to a lot of ceremonies,
Indeed.
right?
And the very first one was at the Cathedral at St. Joe's. And what I wanted to do was calm fears, but at the same time I wanted to calm people's anger. Yeah. There was obviously a direct reaction to Muslims, and so you want to kind of keep that placated as much as possible. On Constitution Plaza, we had a ceremony with, thousands of people, and then I went down to Bridgeport and Fairfield County and did a number of ceremonies down there and met with a lot of families. So I went to a lot of funerals, and so it was, at that point, I thought my job was to continue to try to bring back hope and to remind people that we're going to get past this. We're going to, because I got to tell you, people... Remember those first few weeks? I mean, the country shut down. I mean, there wasn't any work, and the numbing effect was extraordinary. But you don't want the numbness to become anger. You want the numbness to become hope.
Right.
And I think that's what we're all trying to accomplish.
What were the weaknesses that you thought were exposed during that time and that have greatly improved?
Well, certainly airport security.
Yeah.
And don't forget, these planes came out of Boston, which is close to our, flying capacity here in the Hartford and New England region. So obviously, just the way all of our lives have changed, how we become a little bit more suspect of packages, people, things. We had the Lundgren case with anthrax.
Right.
People forget that we had the anthrax death, one of only 5. So you don't want to become paranoid, but you want to become careful and prudent. And so when Mrs. Lundgren died, 93 years old, in the anthrax case, that starts to spook you a little bit about, all powder is a problem in every package, but there's a balance. And I think this country has accomplished that balance of security and being careful. Whether it's airport security, everybody's adjusted their habits, and I think we're in pretty good shape now.
Right. What will you do this September 11th?
Well, I'll probably be over at New Life Church, which is my church in Meriden, and I'll probably go to that. We're going to have a 9/11 ceremony, and as a matter of fact, our pastor went down to New York and interviewed a couple of the firemen that actually survived the buildings falling down, so that was pretty cool. And I might do maybe a couple of other ceremonies and some events in the week following.
Right. And will you do something special on your show the week before?
Absolutely. Matter of fact, I had a lot of callers, WTIC 1080, Monday to Friday, 3 to 6. I just happened to plug that in. But the Friday before, I'm going to talk about it, kind of what happened that day, mainly because a couple of callers said, hey, would you just talk about that? So I'll spend the show saying, here's what happens, here's what transpired, here's how your state responded, here's, I can tell even, kind of a funny story the weeks later about the guy that traveled into the airspace near Millstone.
Oh, right.
So I'll try to, explain all the contact with the families and, kind of the relationship that's been built and what we try to do at Sherwood Island.
Right.
And I think people, I think it'll be a period of time coming up to that day, to this date, that, we'll all reflect on what happened 10 years ago, probably more so than the first year or 2 or 3, and just look where we've come as a country, where we've come as a nation, and just think about how fortunate we are. One of the things I say in my Hartford Current editorial is, on that day, 3,000 people didn't return home. And so I guess the subtle reminder to all of us is that when we go out that door, we may not come home, and sometimes faith, family, and friends are the most important things in our lives.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, we appreciate you coming by and spending some time with us and giving us some insight into that day. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Coming up, races for town councils and mayors and first selectmen are heating up in towns and cities across the state as primary day approaches.